Hi everyone. So today we are going to discuss about a page layout, and this one covers chapter 6 of your textbook. So we'll be discussing about page layout basics. But before we start, let's talk what page layout is. So basically, page layout is an arrangement of page elements aimed to provide the best user experience. Or you can say page layout is the part of the graphic design that deals with the arrangements of visual elements on a page. So if we go to any site, say, let's go to bbc.com, okay? So you can see here that the visual elements here or any other elements, all the elements that you can visualize are arranged in a specific order for the best user experience, right? So you can see the navigational area on the top, then you can see different newses in different like div boxes, right? And in the bottom, you can see you can see the footer, you can see the link to the other language pages of BBC, and then also the news, different news or the articles are arranged in a specific order, right? So in the previous chapters, we learned that we can achieve many of these using the HTML structural elements. If you remember, what are those structural elements? We had like a div element, we had like a nav element, main, header element, footer element, aside element, like, right, article element. But today's discussion is a little bit different. Like, how can we use CSS also help us to do the page layout? So basically, obviously, we know that HTML elements can uh, help in a great deal to do the page layout thing, but we can actually use CSS to leverage it further, right? So for example, if you remember when we were discussing about CSS, we had showed you one example. So let's go here. So if you remember, like we had showed you, suppose this example. So here if you remember here, what we had done here is we had this div element, header, nav, main, footer, all these structural elements. So we used all these structural elements to do some kind of layout or design some kind of layout. But on top of that, we also did something. So if you see here that div element, this one actually acquired its CSS design from this class, from this ID selector. And if we go inside, this one came from trillium.css. This is an external CSS. So let's check that external CSS and what was there in that div class. So this was the design for the div element, right? So you can see that CSS property width was used. So what happened is the value of width was put to 80%. That means the div area, if I go back to my page, the div area, you see it here, you can see that the yellow area is me. So it means that the div area takes the 80% of the 80% of the area that I can see here, or 80% of the body, because the div area is div element is a child of the body element. So once you have percentage, once you say like width is 80%, it means that this div area is going to take 80% of the body. And if I put hover my mouse on it, you can see the yellow areas are the like on two sides. So 10% on the right, 10% of the left are left, and the rest 80% is used for the div. So through doing this, what we make sure is we are actually centering the page. If we hadn't done this, let's see what would have happened. So if we didn't use this design, you can see if we hadn't done this, the div area would have taken all the 100%, all the way from left to right, okay? So this is one example of how CSS is brought into action to help in page layout. So if I go back to the BBC site that I showed you, if I go back there, here also you can see this, right? So you see there is some empty space on the left, empty on the right, okay? So it's similar to what I just showed you for the example here, right? So it's similar to this. So this means that probably even in the BBC side, they're using CSS to center the page, okay? So this was just one example, but today in details, we are going to discuss how CSS can be used for page layout, okay? So let's go back to our slide. So we'll discuss CSS box model, which is very important. We'll configure width and height with CSS, which is also very important for page layout, using the width and the height property. Already I showed you the example with the width property, right? So we'll talk about margins, float, fixed, relative, absolute, and sticky positioning. How can we create 2-column page layouts using CSS, etc., etc. So all of these won't make sense now, but as we will proceed in our today's lecture, these things will be more clear to you. Okay, so let's start with the width and the height property. And I already have shown you one example with the width and the height property. Okay, so let's see how these two properties can be used for page layout. So first of all, what they do, what does the width and the height property do? So the width property configures the width of an element, and obviously height property configures the height of an element. Then we'll talk about the min width and max width, and then we'll say, like, we will discuss why these min width and max width, these things are important when you are using the width property. Okay, so before we show you the example, let's say how the values of the width and the height property will look like. So the values of the width and the height property can be in these units. Pixel, which is defined by the number of pixel values, em, which is configured with a value relative to the font size, percentage. I think I showed you just at the beginning of the lecture, we showed you one example where the value was in percentage. So the percentage configures the percentage value of the parent element, okay? VH configures the value relative to 1% of the viewport height, and VW configures the value relative to the 1% of the viewport width. Okay, so what is the difference between these percentage and VH and VW? Very carefully notice this. So if I go back to the example from chapter 3, we showed you that this div element acquires design from the ID selector wrapper. Now, once we looked into the design, we saw that this ID selector, the design rules were defined here, and it said the width is 80%. What it means is, if I go back to the slide, once you have the value in percentage, it configures the percentage value of the parent element. Okay, so what is the parent element here for the div element? The parent element is the body element, right? Because the div element is inside the body element. So that means the div element will take 80% of what? Of the body, right? So if I reduce the size of the body, you see still the div element is taking 80%. If I increase the width of the body, the width of the div element is also increasing, but the ratio is always, if this is 10, this is 8. Okay, so there goes the percentage. Now, what about VH and VW? If this thing was defined in like instead of percentage, if it was like VH and VW. Okay, in that case, the size of the div would have been dependent on the size of the viewport. So in our case, the viewport means this is the area that is totally visible. So this is the viewport for us. So in our case, the body is the viewport, but just to give you a little bit more example. So this is how the viewport looks like. So say, okay. Okay. So say now the viewport has changed. I have changed the viewport, and you see this is only the viewport that I'm seeing. Okay, let's remove this. Okay, so this is the area, or let's increase the viewport now. Okay, so this is the viewport now. Let's increase the height of the viewport. So if I had used the VH and VW, those units, in that case, the percentage would have been calculated based on the percentage of the viewport that I'm seeing. Okay, so this is the difference. One, if I just say percentage, then this means the percentage of my parent element. But if I say like VH or VW, it configures the value relative to the 1% of the viewport height. Okay, so here is one task for you. Go to like, just Google this, say VH CSS property. You can check that in W3C, W3 school, okay? And here are the CSS units, and go and play a little bit around them. How does, you can try it here, and see what is the difference between this percentage and VH and VW, okay? So this is a task for you. Okay, next. Now let's talk about min width and max width property, why we need this. Okay, so here is that I am going to show you one example. I think that example will help you understand why we sometimes need those properties as well. So here is a page, you can see it here. Let's do this, Control-Shift-I. And as you see, okay, so you see this first. If I increase the width of the viewport, this area is also increasing. Then if I decrease it, this one is also decreasing. So it looks like there is some kind of maybe a ratio, but very careful look at this. If I decrease it further, at one point, this thing is no longer decreasing. So you see that? So this is increasing. This area is decreasing. So basically, this is the div area. So the div element, width of the div element is decreasing, but it stops decreasing at one point. And then even if I just make my viewport smaller, you see my viewport is getting smaller, right? Even with that, this div area is remaining fixed. So if I go to the style rule, so we see that the style rule here says this one gets its style from the wrapper ID selector. So let's see how that looks like. So what are the design rules shown there? So you see, okay. If I go to the Look at this one. Okay, so here, okay, so the rule is for the body. Okay, so here you can see, here is the rule for the body, design rule for the body, and it says width is 80%. Okay, so here is the thing. The body takes 80% of 80% of its parent. What is the parent? Well, the viewport is the parent for the body. Okay, so it takes 80%. That is fine. Now, so this is the body, right? So let's go here. So if I go to, this is the body, right? And this body takes 80% of its parent element. So the parent element is the window, right? Window, or we can say the viewport. So it's 80% of the viewport. Then if I increase the viewport size, the body is also increasing. Okay, that is fine. The size of the body is increasing. But if I decrease it, at one point it stops decreasing. Now, the mean width is important because it says that the body is going to take 80% of its parent element, but it's the width of the body is at least 750 pixel. Okay, so what happens is, suppose now the body has, say, viewport has a width of 2000 pixels, so the body is going to be 80% of that, that is 1600 pixel, right? If I reduce the viewport to say 1000 pixels, now still the body is going to be 80% of that, right? The width of the body is going to be 80% of that. That means 80% of 1000 pixels is 800 pixels. But if I reduce it further, if I make the viewport, say, 500 pixels and the width is 80%, what's going to happen is the width of the body is now going to be 400 pixels. But this mean width says that, okay, but it cannot be less than 750. So this is a fixed. If I am more than 750, I increase, but if the 80% of my parent is less than 750, then I no longer become smaller. Now, this is the important thing. If I remove this, if I had removed this, if the mean width wasn't there, then what would have happened is this would have been fine. This would have been fine. But once I had decreased the viewport size, you see, it kept on decreasing. And then you see the text, the nav area, everything was getting like botched and they were getting on one another. The reason for that is still the body is always, the body is always maintaining the 80% of the viewport, right? So once the viewport becomes smaller, 80% of the viewport also becomes smaller. And as a result, everything was just trying to make space and getting on one another. But since I did like, since I said like, since we had this mean width of 750, then we had a minimal or minimum width for the body, which made sure that after a certain point, the width is not decreased anymore, and so that the text and other things are in order. Okay, so here is the importance of the mean width property. Similarly, the max width property sets, that one sets the maximum width of an element. Okay, so the max width value can reduce the possibility of text stretching across large expanses of a screen. So here is the same example. Let me show you this example. Suppose you are seeing this page on a big screen, say 8,000 pixel. Now, what happens is, since we are saying that this body is going to be 80% of the viewport, now 80% of the 8,000 pixel is going to be like 6,400 pixels. So this body is going to be really wide, right? So if you make this body really wide, what may happen? These text and other things may look really small, right? And they can be far apart. So in that case, we put a max width, making sure that this body is not stretched too far. Okay, so that's the importance of the max width. Did you get my point? Okay, so if you want to look at one example for max width, do the same thing. Go to Google it, check max width in W3C. Okay, and you can see the examples there. Okay, next, let's talk about the box model. This is very important because the CSS, the box model means, what it means is, this is what it means. Let me show you. So any HTML element has these things. So it has it's actually you can think any HTML element is a rectangular element which has content in it, and then it has a border, and then so what this is. So let's see. So the content is a text inside any HTML element. Padding is the area between the content and the border is the between the, you know what a border is, right? Now the final thing is a margin. It determines the empty space between the element and an adjacent element. If I show you one example, I think that would be more easy to understand. So you can see two elements here. The first one is a header element, heading element, and the second one is a paragraph. Okay, so this text, the heading text, is a content. Similarly, the text of the paragraph is the content. Okay, so as we said, any HTML element has the content, then it has some padding. So padding is the space between the content and the border. Okay, so this is the padding here, this is the padding here, this is the padding here. Okay, in this case there is not any we can't see any padding. Okay, so the padding is missing here, and next comes the border, right? And finally the margin. The margin is the gap between one element to another element. So you see this is the margin, right? This is the margin in between one element and the other element. Now obviously you may have a question like, why? Okay, I have already created a web page where I had like different HTML elements, but I couldn't see any border, right? And I couldn't see any, say, I didn't see any other things, like I didn't see any border. What does this border come from? The reason is, by default the border value is 0, so that's why you couldn't see it. So even if I go to one example, okay, so let's say go to the previous example that I showed you. So inside this you see there is let's go to the main. So inside this you can see there's a paragraph. So do you see this thing? Do you see that the paragraph is actually a rectangular element, right? It's a rectangular element, right? This heading, this is also a rectangular element. This is also a rectangular element. The only thing is, all these elements only have the contents. It doesn't have the border. It doesn't have any padding. So how do I, or it doesn't have any margin. So how do I add? Actually, there is some margin. So there is the yellow area is the margin. Okay, so how do I add the border and the padding? So we can do that using the CSS properties. So suppose if you want to, I think in the previous lecture you saw how to add padding and how to create borders, right? When we are discussing the CSS, if you want to add margin, say if you want to add margin, you can do this. So for an create a rule h1 and then say margin, this is the property, and you can have like two values. If you have two values, this one is for the top and the bottom, and this one is for the left and right. If you have four values, then this is for the top, this is for the right, this is for the left, and this is for the bottom. Okay, if you have three values, what happens? Which one is for what? This is your task to find out. If you have three values, what is the, which one represents what? So if I show you an example, the same example that I showed you, that was being shown on the page. So Control Shift I. So here you see inside the div, we have, yeah, so we have, this is actually a div element. And then we have a heading element, okay? So now you can see the color. So the light blue color is the color for the content. The purple is the color for the margin, not margin, sorry, padding. Then this is the border, you can see it, right? And finally, the yellow area is the margin, okay? Yellow area is the margin. Whereas here, it has these light blue area as the content. We have the thick margin, and then we don't see any padding here. Sorry, we see the thick border, but we can't see any padding here. So let's see why there is no padding for the div element. Okay, so let's look at this one. So you see this design is defined here in box, right? So this one has a border of 5 pixels, which is thick, solid, and the color is black, but it doesn't talk anything about margin or padding. Whereas this heading one element, this one specifically talks about the padding. Do you see that? So 20 pixels. So 20 pixels in all directions, this, left, right. Okay, on the right, you can see more. The reason is this is a block element, right? So although there is only 20 pixels here, but block element makes sure that it takes all this space to the right. So if I make it say 20 and 10, now it's 20 on the top and bottom and 10 on the left and right, okay? What if I put another value, 3 values? That was your task, right? Okay, but in this case, this design rule doesn't define, any padding. Yeah, no padding is defined here. So by default, the padding is 0. Okay, and the border is even thicker here. Okay. So none of these have used margin. So add your margin property here and see what happens. Okay, so this is also your task to practice at home, to see if you add margin property and put values like 1 value, 2 value, 3 values, and 4 values, then what happens? And once you hover your mouse on the elements, you can clearly see the things. So you can see in different colors, right? So different colors will represent the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. Okay. So next, the CSS box sizing property. Okay, so how this is, this helps in a page layout. Okay, so the default value, we already talked about the width and the height property, right? Now the default of the width and the height, that considers only the content. It doesn't consider the padding, border or margin. It doesn't consider that. Now what happens is, let me show you one example. So here is one example. Here you can see we have three div elements, and if I want to look what design they're following, let's go inside and see what design they're following. So this is the design rule, right? Because all of these are using the design rules defined in pod class. So the pod class says the width is 30%. So once we say like 30%, now very carefully notice this thing. So this one also has some padding, margin, border, etc., right? But once it says like 30%, what happens is this means that by default, as we said, by default, the width value only considers the 30% of the, what can we say? Say 30% of the, so it only considers the content. So the content here is just the text to see, right? Okay, so 30% here, 30% here, 30% here. So that means the div element, what is the, first of all, what is the parent for this div element? The main, right? So this is the main area. Okay, now this one will take 30% of the main. This one will take 30%, and this one will take 30%. Now what happens is, since once it calculates the 30%, the default value of the width is the value only for the content. So it doesn't consider whether there is some padding or margin, etc. So that's why you see it here. Okay, so if I go to the example here, so this one will take 30%, this one will take 30%, this one will take 30%. Now your question might be, okay, come on, why this box is not going here, right? Okay. The reason for that is this one is not considering the padding or margin or border. Okay, so how do I make sure that when I am calculating the width, everything is being considered? So for that, there is a property which is called the box sizing property. So this is the property. So if you have a box sizing property, and if you put the value as border hyphen box, and then if you put a star here, so this one will apply on all the elements on the page. So let's look at the next one. Okay, so here, let's look at this one. So what is the difference here? The only difference here is still it has that's 3 div elements. The only difference here is now the design rule says, so this is the design rule, right? Now at the beginning of the design rule, we have added this box sizing border box. Okay, do you see that? So now it makes sure that when I say 30%, it means my content plus padding plus margin plus border, everything together is going to be the 30% of my parent element. Okay. 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 Now, once everything is considered, now all these three boxes now fit in the same line. Okay. Previously, in the previous example, how can I move this? Okay, I can move this. That is fine. In the previous example, only the content was being considered because I wasn't using the box sizing property. So these three div areas were not fitting in the same line. Okay. So now you understand how the box sizing property can be used through this rule to make sure that the width and the height value considers everything, not only the content, but also the padding and the border and the margin. Okay, so this is another of your task. Go to W3 School and search for this and look at more examples for more understanding. Or you can go to your textbook. W3C, okay? So CSS box sizing, this one will actually give you, this one actually shows you the example, how without, yeah, it actually defines everything very clearly, how this box sizing property makes a difference, okay? What problem you may face and how the box sizing property may help you. Okay, so next, let's talk about, we talked about box sizing. Now, next is a very important topic, which is the flow. Flow means once you are adding different elements to your page, how those elements are going to be laid out on the page. So obviously, if you don't do anything, they will follow something which is called the normal flow. So what does the normal flow mean? So it means that if you have a page here, so let's see here. So you have body, then you have main, then you have, yeah, let me show you another example. Okay, so this one, suppose this one. Inside the body, first you have a heading one element, then you have a div element, right? So how they're laid out is they use a normal flow. So if you put something first, it will be shown first. The next element is shown next. Similarly here, in this example, we have the body, and then inside the main, we have a heading one that is shown first. And then we have the div elements, and they are actually shown one after another. So that is the normal flow. So they will be shown sequentially. In this case, the boxes are actually shown side by side because we have used the width property. But it's still like the first one comes first, the second one comes second, the third one comes third, okay? So that is what we call the normal flow. So if I show you one example, so this is, oh, not this one. Let me show you, so this one, normal flow. So you see here, we have like two div areas, right? And width property is not used for any of those. Yeah, so height property is being used. It says 200 pixel, and the next one is 100. So this one is higher than this one. The second one is like width. The second one also uses the width property. That is fine, but it's not, the value is not in percentage. Okay, so that's why what happens is these div elements. So the first one takes the design from div1 class, the second one from div2 class. And then we have a paragraph. So they are actually laid out sequentially. The first one goes first, second one goes second, third one comes third. So this is the normal flow. Or if we have like nested elements, let's look at this one. Control-Shift-I. So this here you can see we have a div element. Inside that we have another div element, and then we have a paragraph. So this is nested. So this one starts first, but it doesn't end first, because before it ends, we have another div element. Okay, so that goes inside, that one ends, and then the first one ends. So you can see just it follows the same rule of a normal. So that's why it's called normal flow. The first one that is defined here is going to be shown on the top. The second one is going to be shown next to the first one. The third element is going to be shown on the third one, and then if I add another element in the bottom, that will be shown here, right? So this is the normal flow. Now the question is, like, if I want to float something, that means suppose here in this example, we have a heading, we have a paragraph, and then we have an image. Now I want the image to be floating. I want the image to float in the right or left. What do I do? Okay, so there comes the float property actually helps there. So if you say float right, it will be floating in the right. If you didn't have this, what would have happened? Obviously, it would have changed into normal flow. Let me show you one example. A simple example. Control-Shift-I. Okay. Now look at this one. So inside the body, we have a heading 1. That is fine. We have an image, and then we have a paragraph. Okay. Now image, this one takes the design from this ID YLS. Okay, do you remember why we are not using class here instead of ID? If you remember from the previous lecture, class is used if the design rule is used for multiple elements, right? And ID is used if the design rule is used only for one element. Okay, anyways, let's go to see what design is defined there in the CSS, using CSS. So you see float right, okay? So it says that this element, this one comes first. Okay, next one will be floating in the right. Okay, so that's what is happening here. So if I say float left, now this one will go to the left. That is fine. But if I didn't have the float, what would have happened? Well, in that case, these whole thing would have been converted into the normal flow, because there is a heading 1, then the image would have been appeared, and finally the paragraph would have been appeared in the bottom. Okay, so you see that I remove the float. Now this is what happens. So float element, this CSS element helps you to float an item or to the left or right. So you break the normal flow and make it like adjust it and to change the layout of the page. Now next is, okay, so you understood how float property is used to float an element to the right or left. Okay, so next, let me show you one example. So what happens is, okay, let me show you the example from here. Okay, so once something is floating in the left, the paragraph is here. Now you can see it. Let's look at this example from this screenshot. So once something is floating in the left, there is a space in the right. So next things in the order is going to be placed here in the right. So the paragraph is placed here, and then there is a heading 2 element that is placed here. The problem is the heading 2 element is placed here because there is, after floating this thing, there is area or space, or empty space here. So the heading 2 element goes in there and takes this space. Okay, so because this is floating, but everything else is using the normal flow, right? So this is using normal flow, this is using normal flow, this is using normal flow, this is floating on the left. So everything that is using normal flow or following normal flow will actually take their space just wherever they can, right? Wherever they will be able to. But if I want to make sure that, okay, so how do I make sure that this one is going to be placed not in the open empty space behind, beside the image? I want this to be placed in the bottom of the image. In that case, I have to do something. So this is called clearing the float. So clear property, this is the next CSS property that we are going to talk about. This is useful to terminate a float. Okay, so let's go and check the clear property. So clear CSS. Okay, CSS clear property. Okay, so the clear property controls the flow next to the floated element. The clear property specifies what should happen with the element that is next to a floating element. Okay, so if I go here, you see this here. So we had a div element. Inside the div we have an image which is floating, and then we have a paragraph, and then we have a new line. Okay, we have a new line, and then we have the h2 element. So everything is defined using CSS, right? So let's check this float class and the clear left class. The image is taking its design from the float class, whereas the new line is taking the design from the clear left class. So if I go inside the style element, you see here, okay, so you see this is the float class. It floats the image to the left. That is fine. Now the clear left, this one just uses a clear property and to the left. So what it says is this one is going to be, it says that what's going to happen to the next element after float. So the next element is going to be, so if I go here, so the clear property specifies what should happen to the element that is next to the floating element. So it goes to the new line. Okay, so this one, instead of just trying to push and take the space here, this one starts in a new after the float. So basically the float is cleared and then this one is being displayed. Or you can, instead of putting it in a new line, what you can do is, let's see. So let's look at the design rule here. So clear left, it uses the clear property and it clears the left float. So you can directly apply this design rule to the H2 element. You can directly use this. So you have this image, then you have this paragraph, and then you can just use this design, clear it directly. You can apply it to the H2 element, and that one will also clear the float. Okay. Okay, so next There is another way to clear the float. This is called the overflow property. But basically, this is a way around to clear the float. This is not exactly meant to, this is a way around. So this is a trick. You're using a trick to clear the float. How do you do that? So let's look at this, what overflow property does. Overflow, okay. Okay, so if I want to understand this, so what overflow property does is, the overflow property specifies what should happen if content overflows an elements box. Okay. So overflow property has different values: scroll, hidden, auto, clip, visible. Let me show you the example. Again, if I go back here. So here you see that the image is actually inside the div element. Do you see that? So the div element has two child elements. One is the image element, and then the next is the paragraph. Now, the image element is actually overflowing the div. You see, because it has a height of 100 pixel. Okay. So what can be done is, if you use overflow property, yeah, so these are the value of the overflow property: visible, hidden, clip, scroll, auto. So it says we particularly use auto to clear the float. It says that if overflow is clipped, a scroll bar should be added to see the rest of the content. Okay, so basically here you see, okay, so here the float is cleared, right? But this one is not done using the clear property. Rather, what is used is, let's check. Okay, so let's go inside the div element. Here you see the image element gets its design rules from the float class, right? So the image element gets its design from the float class. So let's see what is in the float class. Or let's look at this one. So this is the div element, right? So there is a rule defined for the div element here. So it says overflow is auto. So what it means is, if something inside the div element overflows the div, then actually, what can we say? So its overflow is clipped. A scroll bar should be added to see the rest of the content. So actually there is enough space here. Actually there is enough space here, so we don't need any scroll or anything. Okay, so this is probably getting a little bit complicated. I will keep this also. You can actually look at the demos here, but for now just remember that if you use this overflow property with the value of auto, that one will also clear any float that is inside that element. So inside this div element, we have this, inside the div element, we have this image, and the image was floating, but the div property design rule had something like this. So it said overflow is auto. So what happens is, everything that comes after the float or after the div, right? Everything that comes after the div, it will already have a cleared float. Okay. Okay, so next. Okay, so we talked about the clear property, we talked about the overflow property. So the overflow auto was applied to the div that contains the image and paragraph. Now the background extends to h2 text display and the h2 text display after the floated image. Okay. Okay, so next let's talk about how can we use CSS to create multi-column pages. Okay. So this is called wireframe. Wireframe is, you can think it as the outline or the skeleton of a page. So this is the skeleton or the outline of a single column page. You have the header in the top, you have nav, then you have main, you have footer. So far, whatever examples that I have showed you right today, all of them are like single column. Now, if I want to make it a double column page, say I want to put the nav area in the left and the main in the right, and then if I want to change the skeleton to this, what do I have to do using CSS? Okay, so this is what you have to do. So this is the double column page. You see inside the body we have, say, header, nav, main, footer. Okay, and there is some design defined in this class, this ID wrapper. Okay, so let's see what wrapper has in it. Okay, so what wrapper has in it is, okay, so not wrapper, we're actually focusing on the wrong thing. So this one, what is the difference between this one and this one? Here the nav area has been transferred to the left, right? So that's why it becomes a 2-column page. So how do I do that? I had this header, nav, main, and footer. But usually in the normal flow, right? If I follow a normal flow, then the header would be at the top, nav would be next, main would be next, footer would be next, right? So this is a normal flow, header, nav, main, footer, right? Now you know how we are actually making it 2-column, right? So probably we kept the header like how it is. Then we floated the nav, right? And that's it. Now there is some empty space on the right. So in the normal flow, the main would go to the empty space. And then there is footer next. In the normal flow, it will go next, right? So the only thing that we need to do is we have to float the nav to the left. And that's exactly what we are doing here. So you see the rule for the nav area, right? It says float to the left. And then we define its pixel, like 90 pixel. So that way, it will be like you define the width of the nav area. Okay. So here, just using this float CSS property, we are creating a new column, right? It looks like a new column. Okay. So, yeah, this is the same exact example. Do I have an example for the 2-column? I think so. Yeah, so this is an example. So you see the nav area comes to the left. Okay, so inside we had header, then we have nav, then we had main, and then we had footer. The only thing that was done is the nav area, the design rule defined for the nav area say the float value to the left. If I had removed this, the whole thing would have changed to the normal flow. Oh, okay. So we didn't have anything that would have actually made the things easier. So if I didn't have any rule for the nav area, okay, now you see the header, then the nav, you see, right? Then the main, and then the footer. So it would have been just the normal flow. Let's even remove the rules for the main. Yeah, so now this is the normal flow. Okay. Instead of that, what did we do? I should not save this. Okay, Control Shift I. So how I made it a 2-column page? So let's look at this. So we floated the nav area to the left, and then we said the width is 90 pixel and the padding is 10 pixel. Okay, so the width is 90 and then there is also 10 pixel of padding to make sure that these text doesn't touch the border here. So there is some area between the text and the left and the right. Okay, so 90 pixel, that is fine. Now for the main area, we said the margin left is 100 pixels. So for the main, what we did is we started the left margin from 100 pixels. So 90 is here, 100 is somewhere here, right? So we made sure that the main area starts here. So this is how, using CSS, we actually changed their positions. We first floated the nav area, defined 90 pixel for its width, and then we put the main area. We know the main area would be put here, but we also say that the margin left is 100 pixels. So whatever text starts, so that it starts from 100 pixel. Otherwise, probably it would have started just here, right? Just here. So I'm making sure that after 90, there is another 10, so that the content starts from the 100 pixel. Okay. So this is your task. Check if you remove this thing, margin left, what happens? Okay, so, okay, fine. 2-column page layout. I just showed you the example from here, and I showed you how CSS property is used to do this thing. Okay, so this is more detailed page. Let me show you the example. So using CSS, this is, yeah. So using CSS, we are creating multiple columns. Did Okay, yeah. So using CSS, we are creating multiple columns. So one thing you may have noticed is once I did this, right? these links have no longer so the links, right? If you create an anchor element, usually there is an underline, but here the underlines are gone. So how do we do that? So this is nav area, right? Inside the nav, you see we have these unordered lists, and each of the list element is actually one anchor element. Each of the list items are one anchor element, right? This is another anchor element. This is another anchor element, okay? And this is another anchor element. Now, if I go to the style rules here, let's see if there is any rule defined for the anchor elements. Okay, so two things. First of all, you see this one. So it says that the unordered list, for the unordered list, if the unordered list is, okay, first of all, the nav area, it says float to the left. Yeah, so that's why the nav area is in the left. And the width is 150 pixels. So it's 150 pixel wide nav area, which looks like a column, right? And then it says if the unordered list is inside the nav, then the list style type is none. So that makes sure that even if inside the nav area, I have an unordered list, but you don't see any bullet points, right? I have one list item, another list item. There is no bullet points or 1, 2, 3, 4. How do I do that? I define the rule for the design rule for the unordered list. I say list hyphen style type hyphen type is none. So it makes sure that there is no bullet point or anything. Okay. Next, I also define a rule for the anchor element if the anchor element is inside the nav element. So if I remove this, you see the underlines are there if I remove that thing. So this property is actually being used to remove the underlines. So it says text decoration none. So what it means is if I put this, the underlines would be no longer visible. Okay. And also carefully notice this. This is defined for the anchor elements, only those anchor elements which are inside the nav element, inside the navigational element, not for other anchor elements. So if I add another anchor element which is not inside the nav area, say this is the nav area, right? Say if I put an anchor element here in the main, the rule won't be applicable to this. Since these anchor elements are inside the nav element, only for those, these rules are being applicable, okay? So from this example, I showed you how, first of all, how you are removing the bullet points or 1, 2, 3, those, and then how you are removing the underlines from the anchor elements from the links. Okay. Okay, so next let's go. Okay, so next, yeah, I think, yeah, this was the example that I showed you. how you remove the bullet and how you can remove the underline using the list style type to none and text decoration to none. Okay. Okay, so next is how can I change? So this is the vertical navigation, right? Instead of this, if I want to see things like this, if I want to see these links horizontally, then how can I do that? Okay. Well, you can do that. Yeah. So there is a way to do that. So, but before that, let's go and check the example for that. 6.5 probably has that, hopefully. Oh no, not this one. It was 6.6. Okay. Not even this one. Oh, okay, not even this one. Where is the horizontal navigation example? Let's see. Okay, I can show you from the slide. Okay, so this is what we want to achieve. We are seeing the links like this, right? But instead we want to see them like this. Now the simple thing is, you remember that HTML elements are by default either block elements or they're inline elements. So if you remember what block element and inline element is let me go and show here. Okay, so a block element is the one that takes all the space from left to right, right? So suppose this header, let's look at this one. This header element is a block element. You see it takes all the space from left to right. This takes all the space from left to right. So even this nav element is a block element because it takes all the space from left to right. But in this case, it's taking only a partial space because I already have defined its rule, saying that it's floating in the left and the max width is 150 pixel. Okay. So these are the block elements. Now, what is an inline element? Well, for the inline element, you remember that the inline elements takes the space just based on its content size. So if I hover my mouse on this one, right? Hover my mouse on the anchor element, you see it's not taking all the space from left to right. It's taking only the space based on how much text, based on the width of the text. Okay. So the trick to, but this list item element, this one is a block element, right? So what happens if I have like, say, okay, so what happens if I say have like 4 list item elements? What happens is, since each of them take all the space from left to right, they will be placed, each of them will be placed in a new line. Okay. So if I want to make sure that these are not placed into the new lines and they're listed side by side, I have to convert them into inline element, right? Okay, so let's go back. Okay, let me show you something. Just give me a second. Okay, so you can actually change a block element to an inline element. The only thing you need to do is you have to use this display property. So if you put, say, use this CSS display property and put a value of block or inline, so this one will change a block element to an inline element, and this one will change a inline element to a block element. Okay. So using that, I was looking for an example. Not sure if I have an example. Okay, let's change this one. Let's look at this one. So here, this is a single page layout, right? So inside the div, we have this nav area, but each of them are like anchor elements, right? And they are inline elements, right? But so that's why they are placed one after another. But if I had like the previous example, if I had put a like unordered list, and then put each of them into the list item, if I do that, now you see my nav area changes and they become like an unordered list, right? And as you see, each of the list items are block elements, right? So each of the links go like they change into new line. They place themselves in a new line. So we did two things. First of all, let's remove this one. So let's add these two rules to my page. So if I add these two rules, what's going to happen is the first rule will make sure that for any unordered list, these bullet points are gone, right? And the second one will say that the underline would be gone for the anchor elements. And these rules would be applicable only if the unordered list is inside the nav area or if the anchor element is inside the nav area, right? So if I put this, now you see both the bullet points are gone and also the underlines are gone. Okay, so we removed those. Now I want to put them side by side. As you have seen that the list items, if I didn't have the list items, if there are anchor elements, they were already sitting side by side because all the anchor elements are inline. But let's do this. Let's add more rule. So this one will says that if the list item is inside a nav element, then make the display inline. So this is the display property. Using the display property, what we can do is we can change a block element to an inline element and also an inline element to a block element. So now you see by default, the list item elements are block elements. You can see it's taking all the space from left to right. But now using this CSS property, display inline, I'm changing them to the inline element. And now you see that these three links are actually being placed one after another. And the reason for that is once I have added this rule, these list item elements have now changed into inline elements, right? So this one is taking only the space, which is the similar to the width of the content. This one is also changing to an inline element. This one is also changing into an inline element, okay? So this is how you change this to this, okay? Okay, I hope you understood how we can use the display property, CSS display property, to change one type of element to another type of element, okay? So there are other values for the display. So we showed you that this one and display and the other ones, just go through them and do the practice. Google it in W3C, you'll see examples for this one, okay? Okay, so next, let's talk about CSS pseudo classes. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to show you the examples for CSS pseudo classes. So this is how you define pseudo classes. So using CSS. So this one says like A is for anchor element. And then you put a colon and then you mention the word link. That means the default state of the hyperlink. A colon visited. That means if a link is visited, then change the link color of the link to this. Focus, if the hyperlink has focus, then change it to this. If you hover your mouse on this, if this is already clicked, then change it to this. I'm going to show you one example how you can define CSS pseudo classes. Not this one, okay. Let me close some of these. Yeah, so let me show you this example. So here you see that inside the nav, we have an unordered list and list items, right? Inside the list items, we have anchor elements. Okay, next. Okay, so this is the pseudo classes. So this one defines a rule for an anchor element, which is inside the nav element, right? And then colon link. So it says that the color of the link is going to be white by default. Then colon visited. So if I visit, then it will change to this color. If I hover my mouse on it, it will change to some bluish color, okay? So if I put my mouse on it, you see, I'm hovering my mouse on it. So it's changing to a bluish color. And if I already click on it, contact anyways, sorry. Let me check the style. This one. Okay, so let's make it 0, 0, 0. Okay, so now you see, or let's make it red, then it would be more clear to you. RGB, right? Okay, so now we are visiting the home page, right? So this is visited already. That's why it's becoming red, okay? By default, it's white. If I hover my mouse, it's blue. How do I define this? Using these rules, pseudo class rules, right? So that's exactly what CSS pseudo class is, okay? So this is the pseudo classes on anchor element, and this is how we use CSS, create CSS rules to change the design or the color of an element depending on what state they're in. If they are just unclicked links, or if they're like, if the mouse is hovered on them, or if they are already visited, okay, you can just change the classes. So the rule is the name of the element and then colon, and then this word defines their state. Okay, I showed you one example, is same like this. Okay, next is CSS Sprite. CSS Sprite is actually a technique where instead of using multiple images, you use just one image, and that one actually does a trick for you. So I am going to show you one example, and that will actually clear up the things. So let me show you the example, not this one. Yeah, this one. Okay, so this is from 6.7, this folder. So here, take a look at this one. Here you see we have these links, that is fine. And if I put my link on it, focus on the image here. This image looks like a lighthouse, right? Or a minaret. So this one is a like bright image, but if I put my mouse on this link, what happens is this lighthouse changes into a darker color. Okay, now let's go to 6.7 and see what's happening there. So these folders 6.7. Okay, so look at this one, sprites.gif. Okay, so this one, you see there, this is the image, the GIF, sprites.gif file. So if I make it bigger, so you see it's actually a combination of like, there are two lighthouses here. The first one is like brighter, and the second one is a little bit darker. Okay, so this is sprites.gif. Now let's look at the source code here, Control-Shift-I. So if we look at the source code here, you see this. Okay, so we have this div, inside that we have nav. Inside the nav, we have like list items, we have the anchor elements, that is fine. Okay, now let's look at the design rules. So the design rules are defined in lighthouse.css. That is an external file. So lighthouse.css, okay, fine. Now let's look at the rule here. So let's focus on this part, okay? So you can see here that the rule for the anchor element, if the anchor element is inside the nav area, it says background image is sprites.gif. That is fine, okay? Sprites.gif. Okay. Now, the background position. Oh, okay. Another thing is the nav area. If I go here, first of all, you may ask like why the nav area is on the right. Well, the nav area is in the right because okay, we already know how we can put the nav area in the right. Okay, that's not our focus. We are focusing on the CSS sprites. So okay, so we have put this image as a background image for the anchor element. So all the links are having this image, right? And the background position is right and it starts with the 0 pixel. Okay, now you see if you hover your mouse on it, this is a CSS pseudo class, right? Background position changes to minus 100 pixel and the background color changes to this. Do you see that? So that means if I go back to my image, initially all the anchor elements will have this background image and the position is from 0 pixel, that means on the top. So it shows this top part. But as soon as you hover your mouse on this, what happens is now the background position changes to minus 100 pixel. That means it now starts showing from here, right? That means it shows a darkened image. Not only that, not only that, the background color changes to something else, okay? So basically, the simple thing is you have just one image, but once you put your mouse on the link, instead of showing the top from here, you just start showing from somewhere bottom, 100 pixel bottom, right? So you are actually showing the same image, but a different part. So this is why we are calling this a trick. Well, we are calling this a trick because instead of using a second image, once you're hovering your mouse on it, you're using the same image, but you are just changing the position. Okay, so how this helps? Well, this helps in a lot of way. You now don't have to like import multiple images. You can just use one image and then show different parts of it depending whether you are putting your mouse on it or other things. And this will actually help in cases where you don't have to download. When you are actually loading a page, you don't have to download like multiple images. You just download one image and use different parts of it. Okay, once at the beginning you are using the brightened part of it, then once you're hovering your mouse, you're showing the dark part of it. Okay, so that is how what CSS sprites is. So CSS sprites is, if I go back, it's an image file that contains multiple small graphics. Advantage is saves download time. So this was the image that I showed you. The first image in this sprite begins at the top of the image. The second image in the sprites begins 100 pixel down from the top. Okay. Okay. Okay, next, CSS styling for print. Yeah, if I have an example, let's see. Okay, so here you see we have two CSS files. Okay. So here is one. Okay. If I go to this, Control Shift I, if I go to the design rules, you see two files are attached. The difference is the second one says media equals to print. Okay. So let's see if I try to print this, what happens, right? So what I'm doing now is Control P. Okay, Control P, that is the shortcut for print. So this is ready for printing. Now, do you see what changed? The page looks totally different, right? The reason for that is once I'm printing a web page, there is no reason to print the links because on a white page, you cannot click on links, right? So Control Shift I, sorry, Control P, right? So now the links are gone. The main contents are the same. So the message here is, simple message here is, have multiple CSS files, create an external style sheet with configurations for browser display, create a second external style sheet with configurations for printing, then link them both. And for the printing one, use this media uh, property and put the value as print. So what happens is once you try to print, all the style rules from this second style sheet is going to be presented. Now, what are the best practices? Hide non-essential content. You don't need uh, the nav area, right? You cannot click on them. Configure font size and color for printing. Use font sizes in PT unit, use dark text color fonts, control page breaks. So basically, if you're printing this page, right, you want dark color because most of the printers are, say, black and white, right? So if you want to see the contents of this page, the text should be very clear. So if I go to this page, let's see, we had these two CSS files. This is for the printing, right? So what we did is we just removed the nav area. You see that? Display none. The nav area is gone. And then we changed the color of the header. So let's see what is the difference between this one and this one. So this is the default CSS. This is the default CSS. And this is the printing CSS. You see that? I just removed the whole nav area from the printing CSS. So this same page now looks like this with the first CSS file, that is lighthouse.css. And as soon as I try to print it, control P, then it changes this. So these design rules are now defined by this file, lightprint.css. Okay. Okay, so this is an important thing. Once you are printing a page, try to use a totally different design. So create two CSS files, and depending whether you are printing or you are showing on a page, just use that CSS design rules. Okay. Next, the position property. This is another CSS property. So the values can be static, fixed, relative, absolute, and sticky. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples. Okay, so say for the nav area, you say position is fixed. So what happens is, this is the page you're seeing. Once you scroll down, you see the other parts have been scrolled down, but since the nav position is fixed, this one was at the middle of the page, right? Still it's in the middle of the page. Do you see that? So this is how you fix a position of an element, or relative positioning. So you see this is a paragraph, right? So you position it, you say relative, and then left 30 pixel. So this means the position of the paragraph would be relative to your viewport. So that means it's always 30 pixels from 30 pixels from the left. So that is relative positioning. So this is the example, okay? So if I make it, so whatever I do, right? Always the paragraph is 30 pixels from the left. You see that? Always. So how did I do that? Control-Shift-I. We defined a rule for the paragraph where the position property was used and the value was relative. Okay. Next. So we talked about the fixed, right? Fixed. So what happens is, even if you scroll down, this remains fixed in its position. We talked about the relative positioning. And then let's talk about the sticky positioning. Let me show you one example with this sticky positioning. This one. Okay, none of these. Maybe this one. Even this one. Okay. Okay, so very carefully look at this page, and I'm scrolling down. Carefully look at this nav area. I'm scrolling down, and do you see this? That I'm scrolling down, but it's still the nav area remains here in the top. Okay, so the nav area remains on the top. Everything goes down, but the nav area remains on the top. How do I do that? Using this sticky positioning. So this is how we do that. We define a rule, and where we use the position property, make it sticky, and we say the top starts from 0. So what happens is, even if you scroll down, this one remains sticking in the top. Okay, so that is what sticky positioning is. Next is absolute positioning. So if you say like position is absolute, so what happens is, it will always be so you are precisely specifying this, like 200 pixel and 100 pixel. So it says this paragraph is going to be 200 pixels from the left and 100 pixels from the top. Okay, so this paragraph will always look like this. So your screen might be huge with thousands of pixels. Even in that case, this one will always be here, 200 pixels from the left, 100 pixels from the top. Okay, now the difference between the absolute positioning and the fixed positioning, what is the difference? Well, in the fixed positioning, this one is actually relative to your screen size. So this one always might be in the middle of your screen. Whereas in the fixed positioning, you are all telling it that I don't care whether my screen is big, or I always want my paragraph to start at 200 from the left and 100 from the top. Okay, so this is another task for you. Go to W3 school and play around to see what is the difference between the absolute positioning and the sticky. What is the difference between the fixed, absolute, and relative positioning? Okay. Okay. Next, Z index or Z index. So it configures a third dimension of the stacking order of the positioned elements. Default Z index is 0. Elements with higher Z index values will stack on top of elements with lower Z index values. Okay, so let me show you one example from here. Not this one. Let me show you from W3 school. Okay. So Z index property specifies the stack order of an element. An element with greater stack order is always in front of an element with a lower stack order. Z index only works on positioned elements, that is absolute, relative, fixed, or sticky. Okay, let me show you a demo. So, okay, so here is the thing. So the Z index is, here you can see like 4 boxes, okay? 4 boxes. So this one has the Z index of, okay, so the second box, this box has a Z index of 1, this has 2, this has 3, okay? Now this red box has a Z index of 1. So once it has a Z index of 1, so these boxes are actually put in such a way that they are actually overlapped with each other. So if I change my Z index to 2, now you see this one comes on top of, say, of the lower Z index, okay? If I make it 3, this one will come in, will be shown on top of the lower Z index. So if I make it 4, now this one will be shown at the forefront, okay? So this one works only if multiple elements overlap with each other. And how does that happen? If you use the position element. So let me show you one example. I think that example will really help you understand Z index. So say this one. Okay, so here is one example. Now, okay, so see this one. At the top, we can see the nav area, right? So I am scrolling. You see, I'm scrolling. But this one, this nav area is like, is staying just where it is. Now, if I look at the CSS rule for this nav area, so you see the Z index is 9,999. So it's a very large value. So that means once I'm scrolling, this nav area, obviously its position is fixed. So this nav area is always in the top, and this is actually overlapping with other elements, right? It's overlapping with this image, it's overlapping with this text, but every time it is remaining on top. Because of what? Because of this huge Z index value, right? Now we know that the default Z index value for any element is how much? Is 0, right? Okay. So if I change this to say -10, what happens now? -10, okay? Now what happens is that nav area has disappeared. The reason behind that is this is a background image, right? This background image is also an element, and this one has a z-index of what? 0, right? But I changed my z-index of the nav area to what? -10. That means this background image, actually the nav area is there, but I'm not seeing it anymore, okay? So this is also very important. So go and study the z-index from this one. This is also very important. And remember that z-index only works with this position, because that is the only place where, okay, so here is another example. So you see there is an image, right? There is an image, and the z-index is -1. So this image and this heading is overlapping with each other. Now, since the z-index of the image is negative, the image goes, so the text comes on top of the image. So if I change it to say 1, now the image comes on top, because this heading has a z-index, default z-index of 0, the image has 1. Now the next question, why this z-index is important only when the position property is being used? The reason for that is only with the position property used, there is a chance of overlapping. If there was no position, then what would have happened? The heading 1 would have been on the top. Then in the normal flow, the image would have been like the next item, right? There was no chance of overlapping. You see, the heading, then the image, then the other thing. But since I made the position absolute or fixed or sticky, whatever, now this position would be here, so it would be overlapping with another item, and I have to make sure that which one will be shown on the top, okay? So if I put the z-index as 1, the image will be shown on the top. If I make it -1, then this one will have a z-index of 0 by default. This has -1, so this one will be shown on the top, okay? You see that? Okay. Hopefully the z-index is now clear to you. And finally, okay, so let's talk about fragment identifier. We'll be talking about two things. First, fragment identifier, and next is parallax scrolling. Okay. Okay, so the fragment identifier, this is very important both of these are actually important in single page web pages. So I am going to show you single page web page. Say, let's search my favorite national team, Brazil national football team, who have a very sad history. They're not winning the World Cup for a long, long time. Anyways, so this is a single page, right? Single page. Okay, now see. Okay, so this one actually it changed. Anyways, if I click on this, okay, it doesn't matter on single page or anything. Is the single page. So everything is on the single page, right? Everything is on the single page. So if I click on individual records, it goes to the some portion of the page. If I click on manager records, it goes to some portion of the page, right? If I click on honors, it goes to some portion of the page. So basically what I'm trying to say is I'm not changing by clicking on these links. I'm not changing to a different HTML page. The only thing is happening is I'm going to different part of the page. How do we do that? That's where fragment identifier comes into the picture. So let me show you the example. say here, say here. Okay, so here we have the links, right? And you see we are in the index.html. So if I click on tours.html, it's not click on tours, it's not taking me to another HTML page. It's just taking me to another portion of the page, right? If I click on rental, see, I'm still in index.html. I'm just going to another portion of the page. Contact is taking me to the bottom. Tours, it taking me to somewhere in the top, right? So this is where fragment identifier comes into the page. So you see we have this nav area. Inside that we have these anchor elements, right? Now let's look at the value of the href. It says hash home. It doesn't say like another HTML page, right? Hash home. So this link will take me to where? Hash home. This will take me to hash tours. So what is this hash home, hash tours? The thing is, we have these different sections, right? And we are using this ID attribute and putting it in name, home, tours. Okay, so using the ID attribute, we are putting a value in it in different sections. Okay. And then in the nav area, using the href, we are just putting a hash and then those names. So what happens is if I click on this link, it will take me to this section. Then if I click on the next link, tours, it will take me to this tours section. Okay, so this is how fragment identifier works. You have to define an ID for a section, give it a name, and then link it with an anchor element and put hash and the name of the section or ID of the section. Okay, so there goes the first thing, how fragment identifier works. Okay. Okay, so when you are actually scrolling this, take a look at this. Everything is getting scrolled, right? Everything. Okay. Now let's look at another example. This is what I'm calling the parallax scrolling. Okay, this one, similar kind of page, one page, one column, web page. Okay, now if I'm scrolling, let's look at this. Everything is not actually getting scrolled. So this area is getting scrolled, but you see the background image, that one remains static. Okay, so now it changed, but it remains static for a while. Then I'm scrolling. Yeah, scrolling. Okay, background image change. So basically both of them are changing, but they're changing at a different pace. Do you get that? So they're changing in a different pace. So this is called parallax scrolling. So if different portion of the page are scrolling at a different speed, then we call this a parallax scrolling. How do we do that? Well, this is how we do that. Control Shift I. Okay. So okay, so this is how you do it using the background attachment and putting the value as fixed. So this is the property, background attachment. And if you put the value as fixed, so let's look at this one. So here we had like 4 sections, right? 4 sections. Okay, that is fine. And inside each section, we had a div, right? Div class. Each of these classes had, say, a second. Okay. So each of these div classes, so we have these div class, right? Another div class, another div class. Each of these had some design. Do you see this attribute class? So this one gets designed from tours hero. This one gets designed from rentals hero. This one gets designed from contact hero, okay? So if you go to the design definitions, each of these designs have the same thing. So they have a background image, but the background attachment is fixed. Do you get that? So what it means is, let's show you. So this is the first div element. Say this is the first div element. This one has a background image. Once you're scrolling, this one will remain fixed until everything from the div element is gone. Okay, so now you're seeing the next div element. This one has a different background image. This one is also attached. You keep on scrolling until the whole div text is gone. That image was fixed, attached. Now you're seeing the third div element. This one also has a background image. I'm scrolling, but that one is only gone once the whole div element disappears, okay? So this is how you do parallax scrolling. That means using this background attachment value to fixed, okay? Okay, so we had a lot of discussion. So just we have reached the end of the chapter. We introduced to box models, CSS pseudo classes, how to configure two-column page layouts using CSS, how to put different positioning like sticky, absolute, relative, and how to configure single page websites. Well, we talked about two things. First, we talked about the last one, the configuring single page websites. We talked about uh, the fragment identifiers, right? You remember that? We talked about the fragment identifier. So this is an example of fragment identifier. You see, we are not going to another page. We are just moving to a different area of the page. Okay, so we talked about the fragment identifier where we did this, right? Using fragment identifier, you see it here, right? You see on the address bar. And then we showed you how to do parallax scrolling using this background attachment property. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for whoever has joined the class. And